Hello, Restored Church. My name is Pastor Dave, and this is the Sunday that in Restore's tradition, we always take the Sunday after Christmas off. We like to give all of our volunteers a break, and people are busy with Christmas, and some people are out of town, and so we've always taken that Sunday off and just had a free weekend. But we are online, so our volunteers have had a fair amount of break this year, and so I'm going to just give you some thoughts. I don't know that I'd call this a sermon. I am just here over at the Restored Church office. If you hear some traffic going by, it's because just beyond the camera is Main Street, and for some reason there are cars driving down Main Street. So we're going to look at the Christmas story, and I know you're thinking Christmas is over, and you're sort of right. You may still have some returns and some post-Christmas things still happening, but we're going to look at the Christmas story and kind of from a different angle, and maybe from an angle that we don't normally look at it. And I think it's important to do this, and maybe this will be a bit of our tradition moving forward. Now, the Gospels that we get most of the Christmas story from are the Gospel of Luke, which is kind of the traditional read through the Christmas story. We always pick the Gospel of Luke, and it kind of gives the full picture of Mary and Joseph and their experience and Jesus being born and all of that sort of stuff. It's a great reading. And then the Gospel of Matthew is interesting because when you look at it, and you don't see it in camera here, but I've got my computer here, and in Matthew, in chapter 1, you start off, and it gives just a genealogy of Jesus, of the Messiah, and there's some interesting stuff in there. You can read it and dive into it. Then we have verses 18 through 25. This is the section where it is Jesus actually like being born, and it's short. It is a quick hitting sort of just look at the basic story of Christmas, of Jesus being born. And from there, Matthew starts chapter 2 with the Magi, the wise men coming to visit. Now, we normally place the wise men, the Magi, in our nativity scene and in our Christmas programs and all that, and it's fine. But understand that the Magi didn't come the same time the shepherds came to visit Jesus. Right, the shepherds were told the night of by the angels, and they immediately went and they found the baby Jesus newly born, right? And the Magi, from the best we understand, like the star of Bethlehem, the star, all of that sort of stuff, the star appeared when Jesus was born, I believe, but they weren't anywhere near Bethlehem, and so they had to travel from the east, so we don't know exactly where they came from. I don't know how fast traveling by camel, if that's what they came by, I don't know how fast that is. I imagine it is slow. They maybe had to do some preparations before they could leave. They maybe had to cross different international borders. I don't know. What we do know is they didn't arrive in their traditional nativity scene. They arrived sometime later. Estimates are somewhere between a year and 2 years later after Jesus is born. Now, so they're part of the Christmas story, right? And we always include them in the Christmas story, and I think that's right that we do that. They are, after all, going to visit Jesus just like the shepherds, just like a lot of the other Christmas story kind of revolves around that. So it takes them a while to get there. They don't have an airplane or some fast means of travel. So the Magi, they set out, they journey, they get to Jerusalem. And when they get there, they are looking for the King of the Jews. And so they go to kind of the capital, and King Herod, who is not Jewish, but the Roman ruler at the time in that area, he catches wind of them coming, and Herod is a crazy, jealous man. He is known to kill his own family members to protect his throne. The history behind Herod is he's very deranged, and he is paranoid. And I read an article recently about him where modern psychologists and psychiatrists and stuff like that, they look at these different characters in history and try to see what sort of mental disorders they had, and they debate on the different things that Herod suffered from, because he just acts rash. He has some of his own children killed. He is jealous and insane. So he's a part of this story, and I think it's actually important that he be included in the story. Now, I'm not saying that we need little King Herod figurines for our nativity scene, but I think that him being in the story is appropriate. And so the Magi, they come and they end up meeting with Herod. And it said in verse 7 of chapter 2, "Then Herod called the Magi secretly and found out from them the exact time the star had appeared. He sent them to Bethlehem and said, 'Go and search carefully for the child. As soon as you find him, report to me, that I too may go and worship him.' After they'd heard the king, they went on their way, and the star they had seen where it rose went ahead of them until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they were overjoyed. On coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother, Mary, and they bowed down and worshipped him. Then they opened their treasures and presented him with gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they returned to their country by another route." Verse 13, When they had gone, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream. "Get up," he said, "take the child and his mother and escape to Egypt. Stay there until I tell you, for Herod is going to search for the child to kill him." And this is where the Christmas story takes a bit of a turn, right? And this is part of the story that we often don't include, right? Oftentimes, Christmas, we like to focus on the things that are hopeful, the things that bring joy, the presents, the angels, the declaration of who the Messiah would be. We focus in on those things, and we should look at those things, but we should not look at those things exclusively, because the story is bigger than that. The story has other characteristics and other things. So an angel tells Joseph to take Mary and Jesus and escape to Egypt. And even the terminology there where it says escape to Egypt implies they are in immediate danger, right? So he got up, took the child and his mother during the night, and left for Egypt, where he stayed until the death of Herod. And so was fulfilled what the Lord had said through the prophet, "Out of Egypt I called my son." And that's a prophecy from Hosea chapter 11. When Herod realized that he had been outwitted by the Magi, he was furious, and he gave orders to kill all the boys in Bethlehem and its vicinity who were 2 years old and under, in accordance with the time he had learned from the Magi. So you see the jealous rage of Herod, who thinks Jesus is going to replace him, and he should think that, but he is a man who is afraid of losing his throne. And when he told the wise men that he wanted to go and worship, he was not being truthful with them. He secretly wanted to kill Jesus like he had killed others to protect his throne. And so he finds out that the Magi didn't return and tell him what he wanted, and so he is furious. And he gives orders to kill all the boys in Bethlehem and its vicinity who were 2 years old and under. And so scholars debate on how many children that was. We know Bethlehem at the time is not a big city. Bethlehem, by most estimates, is maybe around 1,000 residents. We don't know for sure. Its vicinity, I don't know that includes any other big towns. It doesn't seem to indicate that it includes Jerusalem. So with this, we don't know how many male children are included in this order by Herod to have them killed. We don't know the current birth rate. We don't know the population. We don't know how many people that includes. Estimates over the years have wildly ranged from in the tens of thousands to 10. So we don't know. It seems like as you pore over different scholars and different opinions, it seems to be probably less than 100. But that's still too many, right? That's still a lot. And it's still a tragic and sad thing. Then what was said through the prophet Jeremiah was fulfilled. A voice is heard in Ramah, weeping in great mourning. Rachel weeping for her children and refusing to be comforted because they are no more. And so we get this prophecy fulfilled from Jeremiah. After Herod died, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt and said, "Get up, take the child and his mother, and go to the land of Israel, for those who are trying to take the child's life are dead." So he got up, took the child and his mother, and went to the land of Israel. And then he would eventually settle in Nazareth, and that's why we call Jesus a Nazarene. And so then you have the Nazarene Church and other groups and stuff that name themselves after that. Now, on a very side note, that's not important. Back in college, Pastor Ryan and I would actually joke around about sometimes starting a church and calling it the first church of the Egyptian in reference to Jesus spending some time in Egypt. So, of course, we never did that. Anyway, side note. Let's look at what this part of the story kind of teaches us. And I think this may be the more important thing you hear this Christmas season. Now, the Christmas story tends to focus a lot on joy. The angels make their announcement to the shepherds, and that's part of it. The Christmas story obviously focuses on the coming Savior and the baby being born, and worship, and the gifts that the Magi give, and all those things. And those are appropriate responses. Joy, hope. Those things are very appropriate. But the story didn't end with joy and hope. It included other characters. It included Herod. The story included the mothers who lost their children, right? It's there. The Gospel of Matthew includes that in the story. And I think that God wanted that in there because I think God hears us. I think God weeps with us. I think God wanted to acknowledge that oftentimes Christmas for many people is not just joy. It is also sadness. It is also hurt. It is also grief. And so this part of the story is included. The prophecy that a voice is heard in Ramah, weeping in great mourning, Rachel weeping for her children and refusing to be comforted because they are no more. That is part of the Christmas story. And can you imagine being there? And you go back to when Mary and Joseph have Jesus. And again, Bethlehem is a small place, less than 1,000 people. And the shepherds arrive in town, and it says they tell everyone. And so the news spreads throughout this little town of Jesus being born. The star, all of this sort of stuff happening. And the news spreads. And so you have Mary, a young mother, and there's all of this commotion, all of this excitement over Jesus. And undoubtedly, Mary and Joseph, as they stayed in Bethlehem for a while, came in contact with some of the other young mothers in town, right? It seems to me that young mothers and stuff and young families, they spend time together. They meet up. I don't know that they called them play dates in in Bethlehem, but undoubtedly Mary and Joseph sat across the table with other young mothers in town. Undoubtedly they saw each other around town. Undoubtedly other young women asked to hold Jesus, and Mary asked to hold their young children. I have lived and witnessed how this works, right? Undoubtedly, Mary and Joseph formed some connections with other young couples that were their neighbors, that had recently had children, potentially the same day or week as baby Jesus was born, right? And then you fast forward a couple years later, and Joseph is warned in a dream to escape to Egypt, and so he packs up that night and they flee. And there are other young families in Bethlehem that, for whatever reason, do not get the same warning. And they stay there, and Herod murders their sons. And that is part of the Christmas story as well. We cannot ignore the grief. We cannot ignore the sadness. We cannot ignore the weeping that is included in the Gospel of Matthew. It is there. It is recorded. It is part of the story. And there has to be some reckoning where we say, if joy is a part of the Christmas story, grief is tied also to the Christmas story. It has to be. The young mothers and fathers who lost their sons in this tragedy are a part of the story. And I think God intended to include them because God intended to say, in this season, yes, there can be joy. In this season, yes, there can be worship. In this season, yes, there can be all of these things. But I see your hurt. I see your sadness. And I'm including this in the story because I am a God who moved into the neighborhood, not to just bring joy, but to also sit with you in grief. And so it's there. And I think that it communicates to us some important things. That sadness can be as a big a part of the story as joy. Right? It is not good to, during this Christmas season, to just wear a pretend smile. It's not worth doing. And if in this season what you really feel is grief and sadness, then tell that story. Because when I read the Gospel of Matthew, that is part of the story that God tells as well. See, it's a story of grief tied to the story of joy. The two are connected. So don't ignore your sadness this Christmas season. Don't ignore your grief. Don't pretend that those things aren't a part of it, because they're not a part of God's account of the story either. As a church, we have kind of used this tagline that we are church for the rest of us. And we have intended to try to be a church that includes those who feel different and those who feel like they have been hurt by the church or pushed out by the church in times past. We have tried to include people who feel like they don't fit in, people who feel like they don't belong in God's house, in God's family. And we've tried to include those people. And I think that in the Christmas season, if we're going to be church for the rest of us, I think we also have to acknowledge that part of the story is the story of grief and sadness. And that in that, We don't have to pretend that it is anything other than that. God included that in his telling of the story. And I think he did that to say, you are not alone. I understand. I'm a part of this. I'll be with you in this. Because just as in the prophet Isaiah, that prophet spoke hundreds of years before Jesus came about Emmanuel and the virgin birth. Also hundreds of years beforehand, Jeremiah spoke of weeping and great mourning. And both of those prophecies became a part of the story. And I'm sorry if we have not included this part of the story often enough, if we have not talked about it. I'm sorry if you feel like you have had to manage your grief alone. Because if that has been the case, it's because we've not done a good enough job of telling you the whole story. And the whole story includes grief and sadness alongside joy and worship. And so we are just on the other side of Christmas. And maybe this season for you has been one where you have had moments of joy, but maybe it's been one where more moments have been of you trying to hide your sadness or grief, you trying to manage those things. And what I want to encourage you is to have no more pretend smiles. It's okay. I want to encourage you that you are not alone, and that grief and sadness are a part of the story as well. And it's part of the story that God told, and I think he wants you to tell as well. I do hope that as you've gone through this season, that you've also had moments of joy and hope. But I also want for you to share the story of your grief and sadness. Talk about it. Don't feel like if you do that, you are going to be a lack of a better analogy, a Debbie Downer. It's a Saturday Night Live reference. Don't feel like that you can't share with other people what Christmas is like for you, because you're afraid that your experience is just going to drag other people's moods down. I don't want you to be there. I want you to acknowledge how you really feel. I want you to be willing to be vulnerable and honest. I think that when we read the Gospel of Matthew, we have often not paid enough attention to verse 18 of chapter 2, where there was weeping and great mourning. And I think that's been a disservice to people. We've not acknowledged your hurt enough. And so I want to just do that this morning and say, you're not alone. And your story has been a shared experience that started in the original Christmas story. God hears, and God will sit with you in the sadness.